Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Imminent and Present, Two Massive Environmental Problems for Our Oceans and Some Suggested Solutions. Today we are joined by Luke Douglas-Home. Luke is a chartered environmentalist who runs a Future Without Rubbish community interest company. The project works across schools in England, Romania and India, and they have run successful campaigns, including One Bag, Zero Waste, as well and paper recycling campaigns abroad. Today's webinar will outline the known problems and some suggested solutions of these two environmental issues, foreshore plastic and historic landfills. As always, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. A massive thank you to Luke and his colleague Iona. I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you everyone here for taking your lunch break out today to listen to us hopefully inform you, interest you, and inspire you regarding two huge environmental problems for our oceans. This year is the second year of the UN's Decade of Ocean Science, and we work for a future RCIC, which Ethne described. We do three things: education, campaigns, and consultancy. And this subject is a mixture, actually, of our campaigns and our consultancy. The campaigns started last year with the Coastline Runner initiative, which is playing now. So that campaign, the Coastline Runner Initiative, is running the coast of the whole up the east coast of England last year, and will be starting again from the spring when it warms up. And it engages with local authorities and initiatives on reducing the plastic pollution, really, of our seas. Now, today, time is very short, so I speak very rapidly, or as rapidly for me as I can. So apologies if that is unclear. The two issues that we want to dwell on today are both imminent and present. And today I've introduced myself, Luke Douglas-Home, a chartered environmentalist with actually the Institute for Environmental Sciences, and I'm known as in media stuff as the UK's Forrest Gump, or the Coastline Runner. And this is Iona, who I know as the data capture queen. Iona.
Hello, nice to meet you.
And the two big problems I'm going to speak as rapidly as possible today about are: the present one is the foreshore pollution of our seas. 80% of the plastic pollution in our seas originates from the land, and we can do something about this. And the imminently getting worse and present problem of the historic landfill sites is the second issue that I want to talk about. And these are massive problems for our oceans, and why historic landfill sites are becoming more vulnerable. I'll explain later when we get to that subject in 5 or 10 minutes. So first of all, the foreshore pollution of our seas. I assume that few of you need to be reminded of the awful facts of what we are enabling in the damage to the biodiversity and the amazing creatures of our oceans and the sea itself. This image here really says it all. This guillemot has died from ingesting huge amounts of little bits of plastic. Looking at the screen now, you can see bottle tops there, you can see fishing line, this bit of plastic. And the thing is that plastic lasts forever. So they get incredibly full, they starve, and they don't feed their young. And this is a problem on a huge scale, not just for guillemots such as this, but for seals, for fish, etc., etc. Now, the data on it is not encouraging, but most estimates put the amount of plastic pollution of our oceans yearly is between 8 and 12 million tons a year. I can't comprehend figures as big as that, really, but it's unconscionable. But the problem with this is that plastics now are in our babies. For goodness sake, in placenta, we have them ingesting plastic, and recent studies from the Netherlands show that it's actually in human blood, microplastics in human blood, and the harm to biodiversity I've alluded to before, with that image before, the guillemot, is there, and we don't know the impact of having microplastics in our blood. So even if you don't care about our environment and its wonderful life forms and fulmars and guillemot, etc., you might start considering the risk and damage to ourselves. We don't yet know the full impact of having blood in our microplastics in our blood. But we do know that the fertility rates of humankind are collapsing, falling off a cliff, and we do know that cancer rates are rocketing like skyrockets. So I wish there was more evidence-based facts about the impact of our plastic ingestion. Now, amongst all the hundreds of kilometers that we've run up the coast, we've encountered wonderful enterprises, from volunteer groups, from small little school groups to big school groups, to councils, to the wildlife trusts, to the RSPB, to the MCS, Marine Conservation Society, to the wonderful 2-minute beach cleans, all these wonderful things, cleaning up and reducing the plastic pollution of our seas. However, I keep on reminding most of our staff is that our primary focus has to be to stop the tap. If you have a bath overflowing in your house, you might go about tidying up the spilt water and mopping up the bathroom, or you might try and stop the tap to stop this happening. And I would suggest that the latter, stopping the tap, is the first thing that must be done before we then clean up. So we, mankind, have got to focus, I think, on stopping the tap of our plastic pollution of the seas. So what are the causes? Having run hundreds of kilometers up the coast and running again later in the month down the coast of Portugal to the Ocean Summit, the causes of our plastic pollution varies quite a lot, but I think we can isolate them into two distinct things. One is intentional and one is idle. And I'd like to speak briefly, concisely about intentional and idle. Intentional, fly tipping. For all the hundreds of cigarette butts that I collect, and all the crisp packets, and all the food waste, food packaging waste, and all that bottles and everything that I collect, will mean nothing, will be totally immaterial unless we can deal with and engage with this problem of fly tipping. Last year, in one country, this country alone, one country, 1 year, 1 million fly tipping events were reported, and this trajectory is growing, and the potential environmental risk of this, I would like to go through. If the IES asks us for another webinar, I can dwell on that, the environmental hazard on that, apart from the aesthetic hazard, which you can see in my slides now. We have to grasp this subject, deal with it, and get on top of it. It's getting worse and worse and is ruinous. And the other one is what I would term the idle pollution. So in the sand dunes, have your fags, and you just stub it out into the sand without really thinking about it. And likewise with your fast food from KFC to Big Mac, enjoy your burger and then you just leave your wrapper, and the same with enjoy your water, your fresh water, and you leave your bottle. It's idle, uninformed, uneducated, unthinking plastic pollution, and this can be stopped, and it is stopped in places that I've run through, which I hope in the Q&A we can speak about at more length, I hope. So the thing is that one of the positive things that I've discovered in engaging with these coastal communities the whole way up last year is that you listening now might think this is futile, this is just pointless. But from my experience, it's not. It's not futile to try and stop this thing. It's not like blowing against the wind. It can be reduced significantly. And what is required in its broadest sense, and I can go through the granular detail of what is needed, what is required is an engaged community, meaning the council, the school, the businesses, and the community at large. And this can be significantly reduced. And 2 weeks ago, I was up at in North Yorkshire. That is a very different and great experience of that particular beach and that shoreline to where I was actually yesterday in Lincolnshire, where during the resort season, during the visitor season, it is a real problem. And we were working with the council there, trying to isolate the causes of the problem for that place in Lincolnshire, as we were in North Yorkshire the week before. And this is work we're doing for our sponsors and also for the landlords and councils along this coast of how to tackle this problem. And so the core message of what I'm trying to say today is that this problem could be seen as so colossal, so difficult. There's no point dealing with it and give up. However, when you have systemic change rather than just volunteer cleanup days and nice 2-minute beach cleans, they're important, but they're not actually going to create a permanent reduction of the problem of stopping the tap. What is going to stop the tap is when we have systemic change involving the council, the businesses, the community, and the schools. And so this photograph here is from Skegness, where I was yesterday, and my point of this slide is that correct disposal is the primary goal, rather than let's say you might say attacking the plastic producers. Why is this pen made out of plastic, and saying actually this should be made out of compostable other materials. That is not the thing to attack. The thing to attack, I would argue, from a systemic point of view, is disposal, is improving the bin infrastructure, and also the signage to stop, let's say, what happens in that photograph of, oh, you've carefully left your waste litter right by the bin. And so you think that's been a good thing. Not the case, because then a seagull or wind will blow it off and it will release. So what we do is we work with councils and businesses and schools going for systemic change on this subject, foreshore pollution, and landlords. Some of the coast is actually owned by by private landlords, which is great, from the point of view that they can put forward systemic, they can put forward our advice that will change the system of foreshore plastic and the actuality. And this is a photograph here of Mayor Tony Tyne from Skegness Council. And they're a very good point. For example, just yesterday I was with the Skegness Aquarium, who had organised a regular beach clean, and Skegness Council now have a lead councillor who is responsible for the cleanliness of Skegness Beach. And we're going to have this firmly in place and operable for the beginning of the visitor season, which hasn't started yet. It usually starts in Skegness in the February half term, so it's soon, but this is good. And so, which I alluded to earlier is the signage, the bin infrastructure. Our advice really goes on going not so much for the threat of punishment of the £1,000 fixed penalty fine if you're caught dropping your cigarette butt, but rather actually much more positive encouragement of you can leave your waste item here, or you are only a few minutes, 1 minute away from here. You might more positive rather than the threat of big fines. The threat of big fines can sometimes have the inverse effect on creating more waste that is more difficult actually to collect of and dispose of correctly, because people are more secretive about what they're doing. And structurally, a point I'd love to make today, and I'd love for your input later, the viewers of this webinar, on questions and answers and advice, is that I would put forward at the moment this diagram which we created yesterday, which shows on the left, it shows that now we have a very sort of top-down-ish kind of approach to the subject of foreshore plastic pollution, foreshore waste pollution. Is national government, county council, borough, and then parish or even town council. And they operate quite separately to the wonderful charities and events that are being done on this subject. So if, for example, you have the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, they organise an event which remains quite separate to the community council, and this really is kind of problematic for data, but also for behavioural change. If you unite these elements, it seems to be much more effective, and certainly the communities that are tackling this subject best have a degree of unison between all the entities. And so on the right here is something that we created yesterday of our thinking and our experience, is that if actions can be from within and congratulated and organised and overseen and reported by the local council and authority, then that can then go up the chain of money and reporting, and then will have more an effect on a bigger systems change. That's our thinking. I would love to talk about it later in our 15 minutes at the end. So, okay, closing the foreshore plastics subject, but not closing the subject of what we humans are doing to our oceans. The second biggest subject for which we've got to be aware of and start tackling is the so-called pollution time bombs that are ticking and going off into our oceans. And this is the other thing that's taking up a lot of our time, as well as the campaigns. Of course, I'm running our consultancy and advising councils and landlords on what to do about this significant risk to them, but also to all of us, to for all of our seas. Now, our motivation for doing this work is not so much the sponsors and people asking for our work, but my sort of personal motivation for it is whenever I think of this. This is a site that will look much like this today, that is in a water basin of one of the main tributaries in wonderful, lush, green, forested Transylvania, one of the main tributaries down to the Danube. It's called the River Mureș. It's by the UNESCO-listed town of Sighișoara. And this is a landfill site that is unmanaged, uncontrolled, and has no, in inverted commas, integrity. It's just basic, sort of 50 years ago, 100 years ago, landfill sites were treated like this, of just put your waste here. And this is just mind-blowingly frightening. Now, relatively, compared to this, this country is beginning to grasp the subject better, and thanks for the EU legislations of the directives going back in the 80s and 90s, we have a managed landfill system, which Iona will talk about in a moment. And I'll hand over now. I've spoken too long. I hope I've informed and interested you in this subject. And later, I hope to inspire you that we can all do something important for these two subjects. But Iona, yes, please.
So I'm going to take you through some of the details on how historic landfills work. As you can see, and as Luke referred to, landfills now are very well regulated in the UK, and there's lots of requirements for landlords to do it. But the historic landfills that we have been investigating are all now closed to new inputs. And when they were first started, they were completely unregulated. Some of them required and did acquire licenses once the Pollution Control Act was introduced in 1974. And this at least ensured that some data was provided on both the content and the volume of waste in various landfills. But there was no requirement for to contain the leachate, which is the liquid that comes off the landfills, or any of the gases generated by biological and chemical reactions within the waste forms, and no buffer zones. So the whole aspect of looking at contamination and risk of historic landfills has never been looked into properly and or managed. So how many are there? Well, looking at the blue dots on this map, they cover the 19,706 that have thus far been found, although it is thought that that's an incomplete number as the research is ongoing. And of those, roughly 1,200 of them, as you can see, are in coastal areas and also in river estuaries and further inland up rivers as well, because there used to be a thought that it made sense to build landfills or place them on the edge of water flows so that the rubbish could be dispersed naturally. So thinking has changed a little bit since then. And what I'm next going to show you is a map of predicted annual flood levels for 2040. So if you can bear in mind where the red zones are here, you will then see how a lot of these landfills are seriously vulnerable when it comes to coastal erosion and risk flooding coming up. So here, if you look at the orange areas, if you can see down in an area called the Wash in Lincolnshire and the east of Norfolk, which goes right down to Cambridge, that is predicted to be, that amount of land will be below annual flood levels by 2040. Over in the west, you have the southwest, there are the Somerset levels, and big problems on Merseyside as well, just north of Merseyside, up towards Blackpool, and on the Humber, also a lot of flooding risk coming up for 2040, as well as the Norfolk Broads in the east and some parts of the Thames estuary. So that is the major threat that these vulnerable coastal landfills face. The other threat is obviously coastal erosion. Here is a picture of Haysborough on the east coast of Norfolk, actually, but there are very similar ones like it further up on the Yorkshire coast, and also problems on bad problems with coastal erosion on the southern coast of England too. In fact, estimates say that 28% of English and Welsh coastlines are facing a minimum of 10 centimetres erosion annually at the moment. That's the rate it's happening now. So coastal erosion is a big threat. So the big threat and the big risk of the landfills is their content. And this is, as I touched on earlier, extremely hard to determine. When the licensing regime started, they were asked to give a rough idea, but as you can see from the categories on this slide, it's not hugely informative. Inert will tell you that it's rubble and soil. Industrial will tell you that it's basically from factories and large manufacturing operations. And commercial will tell you that it's from businesses. Household obviously covers all the household waste that we put out in our bins. And special and hazardous waste has happily started to be defined, and more fortunately is not, hasn't been, as far as we know, identified in a large number. That's a minority of the historic landfills are designated as having special or hazardous waste. But the dates of the other way to pin down a bit more about contents is looking at the dates of when the inputs for the landfills happened. So obviously household food production in the 1950s involved a lot of glass jars and tin cans, but the very, very little of the plastic that we see now. However, industrial waste was a little slightly different kettle of fish, and it's worth bearing in mind that asbestos was only banned in the UK in 1999. So there's a lot of potential hazard up in these things. So how bad is the hazardous? Well, the other issue with this is that the current EU definition, which covers asbestos as touched on, and lots of things like batteries and solvents and print toner, really deals with what is now considered hazardous in terms of how we live now and what we produce. But as again, if you look at the 1950s, there wasn't a lot of print toner around. And so there's a lot of unknowns, and this is the real threat and the worry in terms of content, because we don't necessarily know what we're dealing with in almost all areas of these landfills. And we need to look at content, and we need to look at any provision taken to protect the areas around it. The concept of risk in when some of these inputs were made was completely different to now, as I touched on earlier, with them being deliberately built on the shore so that the rubbish could be washed away. But there is some useful work being done, but there's a lot of academic studies, and some of those have shown that the content thing is such a massive issue. Someone called Dr. Kate Spencer at Queen Mary University discovered a bottle of poison with a skull and crossbones in it, and the stopper put in and liquid still inside, in one of the landfills she was excavating on the Thames estuary. So the unknowns are unquantifiable. But the implications of the unknowns are worth looking into, and I'm sure, given actually the background of a lot of the audience today, you will probably be aware of the death of a lot of crustaceans, crabs and lobsters on Teesside. This happened in the autumn, October and November of 2021, and a lot of research has gone into why these deaths happened and what can be done to stop it. The reasons for the die-off, a lot of things were examined, from algae blooms to licensed dredging to chemical contamination and to possibly some form of aquatic animal disease. The Environment Agency and a number of other organisations conducted the research, and unfortunately there have not been any useful conclusions, which is extremely hard for the fishermen whose livelihoods have been completely wiped out, and all the businesses that rely on the crustaceans along Teesside and along the 70 kilometres of the Yorkshire coast that have been affected. And in fact, a Whitby fisherman on a podcast that was broadcast about 10 days ago was claiming that even though the mass die-off happened on October, November 2021, in the kill zone, there are still no crabs returning. So the implications are huge. And what was interesting about this was one, looking into the issue of liability, whether there is any liability and how easy it is to find things, but also looking at the potential toxicity of so many things that are used very often. Pyridine was considered because it's hugely toxic to crabs, and that's a solvent that is used in all kinds of things, from glues to paints to vitamins and medicines. Suddenly a whole load of information about the impact that that can have, not only on crustaceans but also on humans, is out in the more in the public arena, and it makes us aware of just how many potential hazardous risks are involved in these historic landfills, and the difficulties of not knowing enough about the contents of them. And obviously they have huge implications for other dangers, the waterways that we use for recreation, for swimming, and even the water tables below landfills in some cases, that obviously are vital for drinking and bath and tap water. So what next? We are looking into all sorts of further research. We need to establish more specifics about both the location and surroundings of landfills, and obviously their content and their integrity, being how well what is within them is contained and protected from its surrounding areas. But the key to all of this work is collaboration, and we are in endless discussions with councils, with DEFRA, with the Environment Agency, and landowners and businesses, all of whom have a big stake in solving this problem.
Great, thank you, Ina. Thank you, Ina. I hope I haven't got a clock, but I hope we have 10 minutes now for questions and answers. And I suppose from my point of view, is just, can people tell me now, are your council aware of their historic landfill risk? And just ask them. I think not everything, I think there's such power in just the asking these authorities, what's your risk? Are you aware of your risk? I think can help us all deal with this massive problem.
Thank you so much, Luke and Iona. Yeah, we'll move into questions now. So any attendees, please do put your questions in the Q&A box, and feel free to respond to Luke's question there in the chat as well. So please do feel free to put anything in there. Great, so I'll kick straight off with some of the questions. We've got a few of them coming in. One quick question I just wanted to ask is, you mentioned about the effectiveness of engaging with local communities in coastal areas. Can you talk through some of the kind of effective engagement strategies you've used in that sense?
Certainly. At the moment, we're doing a big analysis for a client on comparing 3 different coastal communities. I'm not going to name them yet, so we'll wait for them to go into this report. But in one where they've got comparatively excellent behaviour, it's really, in their case, it's really about engaging with the business. For example, where it's going really well, the businesses see themselves as part of that community. And so, for example, they are finding alternatives to using single-use plastics. And so, for example, the ice cream van doesn't sell plastic spatulas. So we might think small thing, but he's engaged, and they are thinking about the problem and what to do about it. Then on the other hand, the McDonald's is in one other place, is right by the shoreline coastline. They have, for them, tons of stuff saying we are recycling. There's not one educational element about, can you just pack it in, just don't chuck the stuff on the beach. You know, that little thing is not lecturing, it's just advising, don't chuck it in the bin, would have a big impact. So I suppose to answer your question, Ethne, is engaging businesses in their community is what we have found a critical thing for success or successful or continued problem.
I also think it's about pulling all the different strands together so everybody feels they're part of it. And therefore you build up this sense within a community that everybody wants to make sure, and you give them the sense that they realise the coast for so many is such an asset, and it's part of what makes their community work, so they need to protect it. And if you can get that messaging across, then everybody's behind you and not feeling it's not the ice cream man out on his own. He knows that others are pulling in the same direction.
Great, thank you both. And kind of related to this, one of our attendees has asked, being part of a community like this, what can we do to accelerate your efforts apart from being mindful to our waste and where we put it?
I think the key thing was about the two different issues, about the almost two enormous historic landfill issue. What we individually can do, I think, is asking your council, your local authority, are they aware of their risk if they have any? If they haven't, great for them, great for the community.
We can tell them if they do or not, if they want to check.
Yeah, but just asking the question, are you aware? I think we can all do that, and we should all ask questions more and more, I think.
Perfect, thank you. And moving on to the kind of idea of the historic landfills, which you talked about, Iona, what methodologies, if any, can be used to future-proof historic landfills to prevent leaching or erosion into natural waterways or coastal waters? Is there any real merit in considering re-excavation or relocation?
There's real merit in lots of options. We've been examining this, obviously, to look at a whole load of solutions. I mean, our starting point, because we are relatively we are at the start, is to get a much clearer idea of content. But yes, we've been looking at a whole load of excavating. In fact, Luke was talking to someone in the EU about other options to do that. Do you want to talk to that more?
This is a slightly what's the word? It's a problematic thing for us in this country to hear, but someone with the commissioner was in last week in Brussels, and he just said, amazingly for me, he said, I'm so pleased about Brexit. And I said, what, really? Because this is the opposite to what he usually says. He says, considering with what you just told me about your country's historic landfill sites, they're going to be vulnerable because of the coastal erosion and flooding. This is going to be a monstrously big cost that if Brexit hadn't happened, we would be helping with love before. So good luck. Slightly disparaging, but yes, the
only other thing I would say as well is that we were looking at, just on content, is that people have been looking at the option of boreholes to try to get some more really informed data. So the excavation and everything is much further down the line because it's all about being incredibly careful. But there are relining and protective things that can be done on a temporary basis as well. Sorry, interrupting.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And related to that, actually, we've got an attendee here who said that they're currently working on a NERC research project studying risks of historic landfills in the coastal zone, and that they have updated the existing database of historic landfills to include industrial wastes alongside municipal wastes, and they've completed a national scale environmental risk assessment of these in light of climate projections. They'd be happy to chat through this at some point if it would be useful for your consultancy and campaigning, and they've left their email address, which I will pass on to you.
Right.
So just
Thank you very much, that's exciting.
Are they from Hull University? I hope. Anyway, so yes, it doesn't matter.
Let me double check. Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah. Perfect. And then kind of moving on to this is a bit of interested to know your take on this. Why do you think that plastic is not already biodegradable? Do you think the research costs are too high, or that there's no industry appetite for it, or another reason?
I'm potentially libelous on this subject. the plastics industry from the 50s has been so powerful and so clever about getting us, everyone else, to not see it as the very difficult material that it is. I mean, plastics are wonderful, but they should be used and disposed of, in limited circumstances. To answer your question, I think there isn't the appetite for doing it, because the thing is that plastics are so fantastic and they're so cheap, and there isn't the appetite for finding alternatives, so that's going to be more expensive, and so why do it? I don't want to be libelous, but for example, the whole plastics recycling industry is to a huge extent created by the plastics industry, to have us believe that plastics are as recyclable as metal or anything else, when the scientific facts are, after 3 or 4 times, you can't recycle plastics, and so.
And some of them are too complex to recycle at all. Some of them you can't break down. I mean, the science is developing. They are making less complex plastics, which should be easier to recycle. But as Luke says, there isn't this drive to do it. The plastics industry, I must be looking at this, but they have long supply chains and they have a very cost-effective business model at the moment. And as Luke pointed out, recycling allows them to sort of offset the guilt and the responsibility. I think legislation really needs to change on where responsibility lies on all sorts of disposal, from white goods to everything else, but that's a bit of a tangent. But anyway, yeah.
Thank you very much. And moving back to your kind of community engagement and work in coastal communities, once you've visited an area, what steps are taken that the kind of coastal area is maintained in the way that you've left it?
It depends. It depends on the local authority and the school. In the summer, I ran through Skegness, and last month I made a presentation to Skegness Town Council, and they, I think I said this earlier, they've now appointed someone to be responsible, but at the same time I was with 2 of the schools in Skegness, and they're very much engaged. So the improvements on signage, on bin infrastructure, and on data about what they're doing on the beach, the ingredients for those improvements are being put in place now. And for others, we've given reports to councils, giving advice. And so really our main thing now is just on gleaning as much data as possible, that is possible, regarding places like Great Yarmouth and Gorleston. They are the environmental, they're called environmental rangers, are coming back to me, to us, more on what data they can give regarding Gorleston and Great Yarmouth Beach. They can give us easily the data on FPNs, fixed monthly notices, about the fly tipping, but it's slightly more arduous about the data of the beach. But likewise, the school there is, the 2 schools there are very engaged on the subject. So in a year's time, I hope to be able to report data-wise, to report actually these are the effects of what we've got in place.
One of the earlier questions, I was just waiting till we came back to this, was what to do for one of the listeners living in a coastal community, and we talked about asking about whether they're aware of their risk of historic landfills. It's also a great idea to ask the council who is the lead authority on managing and protecting and looking after the coast, and if there isn't a lead manager of it, could they make one? So that, all again, back to the asking, but asking the questions is a really good thing to do, as well as participating in stuff to help.
Well, thank you so much, Luke and Iona. It was a really eye-opening presentation and really a lot of engagement and questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question today, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I just wanted to flag up a project that the IES has launched last week, which is a collaborative project aiming to bring together the marine and coastal science community in the UK. I'll post a link to it in the chat for anyone that's interested. But that's it from us today. Attendees, thank you very much for logging in. I hope you found that as useful as I did.